Welcome to the Expanding Consciousness podcast with your hosts, Michael Wally and Nicholas Haag. In this podcast, we explore ways to sharpen our awareness, make life more enjoyable, be a little kinder, become more authentic, less reactive, more present, and ultimately expand our consciousness. We're happy to have you along for the ride, and if you do enjoy these conversations, please leave a review or a comment, as this goes a long way for us. Enough of the promotional talk and enjoy this episode. Today we want to riff on the question of how your life changes when you start going down the path of self-realization, or if you want it described in other terms, self-actualization, or perhaps surrendering, or in other modalities, awakening. But to specify maybe like what I exactly mean by this question, I think for me the first experience that had a significant impact on how I see my life was the very simple one that is described in Buddhism, and I think in all forms of meditation that you encounter sooner or later, and it's the situation where you realize that you are not your thoughts. And in that sense, it's the first time where you kind of stop identifying with your thoughts and realize, oh, I'm the observer of my thoughts, and therefore all of this is not me. All of this is a show that I'm witnessing. And when that happens, and when you really start to integrate that, I think it has a wide range of implications on almost anything you do. To give you an example, well, maybe if in each situation or in each conversation, now you're observing like what is your ego producing in terms of like thoughts, how it is reacting, and you kind of have the possibility to either give into it or change the course of whatever the ego wants. In that sense, each situation gets more complex and has more possibilities. Perhaps there's also certain responsibility that comes with that, and I think it's interesting to think like, how does that affect your life, like in an everyday sense. But yeah, now I described it in a very abstract way, but I first want to ask you, Michael, how did it change for you personally?
Yeah. You hit on so many important aspects of really what happens during this process. I think for me personally, it took a really long time to reach a point where I can say that I'm not strongly identified with my thoughts. Like, I've certainly encountered it as a concept, reading about meditation and such. And you can hear it, but then you're still very strongly identified with your thoughts. It's not something that you can just hear and be like, okay, or even really be convinced of. It's something that I kind of feel like you have to experience over and over and over, and in a sense, kind of just almost get tired of your thoughts and just be like, okay, I'm not even really doing this, right? Like, there's a certain point in which you realize that you're not the one producing all of those thoughts, and you no longer, in a sense, want to take responsibility for them. You don't necessarily act on them, but you don't want to blame yourself for those thoughts that come up. I really like this quote from it's one of my favorite books. It's Shambhala, The Path of the Warrior. And the author Chogyam Trungpa, in this, he says something like, no thought deserves a gold medal or a reprimand, right? And then he goes on to describe all, a wide range of crazy thoughts that we might have, and really says that, they're kind of meaningless in a sense. But really going on a tangent here, I guess, back to like, how does your life change? I think your focus starts to change. It's no longer, or it's less, I should say, because all of this is really a matter of degree, and by no means would I say that I'm like at a very high degree, or that I don't still, encounter so many of the issues that, we really try to address by going down this path. But it does get easier. The things that you're working with, like your emotions, anxiety, social anxiety in particular, for me were big ones, and still are. But they don't move me as much. They don't control my life as much, right? Like you were saying, you start getting more options, right? You have a little bit more freedom. You're not as pushed around by seemingly pushed around by the external world. You realize that in a sense you were kind of doing that. You were at the very least allowing the external world to move you in some sense, right? So I mean, it's definitely, I would not go back, right? In retrospect, I'm so much more peaceful, able to enjoy life much more easily. I'm much happier. I can laugh more easily. There was even a point in my life where I thought I really couldn't laugh anymore. Couldn't laugh at things and enjoy humor. So that's changed very significantly. And yeah, it's been an amazing journey and just so impactful, right? And it's one of the reasons that I'm here and share all of this stuff, is because it's made such an impact in my life. Um, how about yourself? Like, what's your experience been of it?
Well, now that you described your experience, it reminded me of something that I like almost forgotten, and it's that after this first realization, there's this process of integrating, and actually starting to accept the fact. And this middle ground, or this middle step, was actually like quite, I don't know what would be the right word for it, but like, well, in a sense, difficult, because now you realize, oh my god, there's all of this extra information that I wasn't paying attention to. And in a sense, having suddenly more awareness also increased maybe my anxiety first,
Mm-hmm.
because there's so much more things to take into account too. I mean, in a sense, not being aware is easy, because it is like being asleep in a sense, or perhaps sleepwalking would be a better metaphor, in the sense that you don't need to, well, you don't need to think, would not be true, but you don't need to put a lot of intention and effort into being. You can just be and react based on your old patterns. And in that sense, I also sometimes, um, well, I'm not jealous, but sometimes I see people who seem to be very much in the phase of being asleep, and I think like, wouldn't it be nice to go back to that state of being, or at least, for a time being, just to rest in that, a little bit, because in some sense, being very aware can also be exhausting, at least one, while we're still in the middle phase where we didn't fully let go, and we are still attached to like many things, but we also let go of some things. But yeah, so one question would be, because you said I wouldn't like to go back. I fully agree. I'm very happy that I'm on this path. I feel lucky in a sense, because I also think there is a lot of coincidences that even brought me on this path. And I can easily imagine a life where I never had this beginning realization of like detaching of my thoughts, and which kind of led me down this path. So in that sense, it's so cool that I somehow ended up on this path. I feel that it's also a difficult path, yet a very rewarding path, yet a very meaningful path. But I sometimes think it would be nice to go back, but I think also that it is not even possible. What do you think? Is it even possible to now say, you know what, screw this path, let's go back to being asleep?
Yeah, yeah. That's a really good question, and I don't think I have a good answer. Um, so in my head, I'm considering like, okay, what would I do to actually go back? And interestingly, this was sort of the other topic we were considering for today, and I think it relates so closely. It was sort of like, well, how do you build up your ego? How really the question is, how do you go back? And what comes to mind first is probably a lot of numbing, a lot of
Mm.
probably alcohol, a lot of avoidance, a lot of blaming, right? Like if I'm not feeling well, I got to find out what thing outside of me caused that, and then try to change that thing outside of me, like very, very strongly, and not take any like internal responsibility, I guess you might say. Um, what else would you do? I think, putting yourself into like echo chambers, places where there are people that have like the exact same perspective, or pick a very rigid perspective and decide, okay, this is my perspective. I don't want to hear anything else. I'm going to argue with anybody that thinks differently. And then put yourself in a situation where you're around a lot of people that think similarly, and really reinforce that, right? Like create a lot of deeply ingrained habits, right? Yeah, those are the things that come to mind. I don't think they're very well fleshed out, but I feel like they're kind of
Mm.
hinting at the right direction. I'm kind of curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, those were some good ideas. Like probably, mind altering substances, but those of the kind that don't expand your consciousness, but those that maybe narrow your awareness. So yeah, like alcohol, I don't know, cocaine, or these things would probably help with, you know, building a healthy or unhealthy ego. But yeah, like what you mentioned, like putting yourself in echo chambers, or people that are not with people that are maybe not so open-minded. The problem with that is, I've also become a little bit allergic to closed-minded opinions.
Mm-hmm.
It almost repels me automatically when when people kind of just repeat some opinions, where you sense immediately, okay, this is just something that they heard, they never even thought about it, laid it out for themselves and made a decision, but it's just repeating stuff that they're hearing. And I think it would be very difficult to go back. So maybe another idea which could help to go in that direction would be, I think, so for me to really go back into my ego would be, I think, a very solid goal. So for example, I want to become an entrepreneur,
Mm-hmm.
or I have this idea that I can realize with entrepreneurship. I think if the motivation and the goal behind it is strong enough, I would be able to say, okay, I'll do whatever it takes, and if that means I need to become, I don't know, a very confident speaker, I need to become a very good salesman, all of these things that perhaps require narrow awareness instead of like uh, wide perspectives. There's moments in life where we need that kind of energy, and where we need to kind of put our heads down and just do downhill work and increase one specific ability. And I think this is akin to going into the ego and growing the ego. I don't have any practical like experiences, but
Mm-hmm.
that's the only idea I have about it.
Yeah, yeah. I think at a high level, it's really about creating and reinforcing rigidity in order to kind of build up the ego, right? Like the ego
Hmm.
needs something to be attached to be identified with. And then the other aspect, which you were mentioning there, is a narrowing or a numbing of awareness versus when we're sort of going the other direction, the direction that we're always talking about and that we really want to head. That's more of an expanding of awareness. That's more of an awakening of awareness. It's cultivating it. It's increasing it. So I think you could almost say any activities which introduce more rigidity, any activities which numb your awareness, any activities which narrow your awareness, those could probably all contribute. The sort of catch with that is, and this kind of goes back to the question of can we go back? And I think this is a really fascinating question, is if you do those activities that would otherwise narrow your awareness, but you do them with awareness, will they maybe be increasing your awareness? Will they be maybe giving you an experience that you otherwise wouldn't have had, that you otherwise wouldn't have been very present for, right? Because that is an aspect of being very heavily entangled with the ego, is you're not exactly present, right? You're hmm, maybe this
Hmm.
starts getting into how much you really reference and hold the past as an important thing. I'm not sure.
let's take a concrete example. For
Mhm.
example, you want to be the president of the United States.
Mhm.
I have the feeling that this is a role for which you need to have a lot of ego. This is like, such a big task that you need to be so focused in it, and any kind of extra awareness would even be a hindrance, perhaps, on the path.
Yeah, yeah. So very loaded example, perhaps, but we'll ignore sort of like the nuances and the politics around it, and just say that you want to take on, right, like some very high position president, right? Very good example, and it's something that you need a lot of. You need to be able to project a lot of confidence, whether or not that confidence is like earned or real. You definitely need to kind of take on a lot of confidence, like, hey, this is something I can do. I'm amazing. I'm going to be the best at this. um
Because one addition, what we do usually in the self-realization actualization is we shake up the ego all the time, right? We try to take almost every opportunity to loosen it up a little bit, to question it, to take one step back and then two steps forward. And I think you would not get very far on this path if you're doing this all the time. Here, for this one, you really need a strong ego. Like you say, you need to be able to project strong confidence, and in that sense, I do think that ego can be a really useful tool, and that perhaps we're sometimes demonizing it a little bit too much. I think that the ego is a very, has a very important role in our lives, and as much as we would like to think that we will reach a egoless state on the path of spirituality actualization or whatever, I think we also need to acknowledge that without the ego we're not going very far in life, and ego seems to be the vehicle to achieve these crazy goals, like becoming a president of a country.
yeah, yeah, it is. Yeah, I really appreciate that you kind of touch on this, because we are always talking about the ego, like, oh, this is a really bad thing and we should just totally get rid of it. Which, like yourself, I don't know that that's even really a possible, if that's really even possible or desirable. I think maybe the way to see it is like, well, the ego is a tool, and it can serve you, right? It can be very useful. It's a tool that kind of it's like creating form in a sense, right? That's what ego is. It's form. And the question of the value of ego, I think it kind of comes down to, and I really love to use this phrase, is like, is this serving me or am I serving this? Right.
Mhm.
And I think that there's a way to kind of temporarily create ego and use that in a very useful way, but then drop it. Right. Like the problem comes in really when you've become identified with what you've created, and you won't let it go. And it's like, okay, it's being challenged in certain ways that aren't useful to you, and then you meet those challenges and you push them back because you're trying to defend the ego, because you're trying to protect this solidity that you've created. And that's the point at which I think that it kind of runs amok, and that it's no longer valuable to us. But when we can use it to like accomplish goals and then drop it, then I think it is actually like a useful thing. And this little thought exercise that we're going through of like, well, you know, how do you become president, or how do you use the ego to do something like that? Um, it's kind of thrown me for a bit of a loop, in the sense that I feel that you could approach this either from a very ego heavy perspective, where where you're not someone on the path, and you're just like very very heady, very very antithetical to so much of what we talk about. But I also think that on the flip side, someone who's on the path can also have a lot of that confidence or something. I think about like spiritual masters and stuff, and just how they're able to accomplish massive amounts of work in their lives, right? And they have a confidence to it, but it's not like this sort of ego confidence. It's almost like there are two different flavors of confidence that you can encounter with this kind of like the confidence that's it's almost like a knowing, right? The confidence that you can maybe get on this path, like, okay, I know I can do this. I'm confident. There's just really no question. Or this other sort of like fake ego confidence where it's more like trying to put up a facade, trying to project something that might not, that you really don't have. And it almost comes from a place of fear.
The knowingness that you described, that I seen people, when I think about that, like I have the feeling that maybe this is not even ego, but this is their unshakable trust in the universe. And when people are able to not question whatever is happening next, and they just have this deep trust in them that whatever's coming next is the right thing, and I am taken care of. uh, I have the feeling that those, or I see this in some spiritual masters and gurus, or perhaps people that we say that they have been enlightened, but obviously they also have egos. So everybody has ego, and yeah, maybe it's good to look at those examples. So let's move away from the example of a president, and if you look at other use cases. So let's even say you want to achieve something altruistic. So you want to do something in activism for a certain cause. You want to collect a huge sum of money for a certain cause. uh, so if you're pursuing that, nevertheless you need confidence to achieve that goal, and you need to ride the wave of your ego for a certain time to become successful with achieving your goal. Yet your goal is selfless. Like, wouldn't that be
Hmm.
examples of people that use their ego while still being in self-realization?
Hmm. Yeah, it's such a difficult thing to talk about from this perspective of like we're still kind of in it, right?
Yeah.
Like I wish that I could talk to this from experience, right? I mean, I've had some experience with it, but not, not the level that we're kind of hinting at. So it is very speculative, right? Um,
Let's take the example of who comes to mind immediately, is because we, in the last podcast, we talked about maps. Rick Doblin,
mhm,
this personality that emerged from the uh, I guess 1760s, where we had the third wave of psychedelics, and who is still now, 40, 50 years later, an advocate, an activist who speaks on world platforms, who goes on, I don't know, Joe Rogan, and
mhm,
who's able to have pushed it this far that we are, close to FDA approval of MDMA. But when you think about the work that he had done of convincing the public that this demonized party drug might be the solution for PTSD and very serious problems. For example, this is a figure where I see, okay, somebody, this person uh, cannot be without ego, right? I think he also needed to be very confident, strong, and perseverant in his
mhm.
attempt.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing is it really could be coming from either place. It could be coming from a place of ego, like I know what's best for people. I've discovered, the healing, the therapeutic potential of these drugs, and everyone needs to take it. Everyone needs to use this, and I'm going to just push for it. I'm going to make sure that it gets legalized. I'm going to make sure that people have access because this is right. This is the answer, right? But at the same time, it could also be from a more altruistic perspective, like this was such a wonderful therapy and it really helped me personally. And I would love to be able to see other people have that, same opportunity. So it's really hard to differentiate in a sense. And I'm wondering what really the difference is. I mean, the way that we're seeing it, the way that we're framing it kind of makes a difference. But is there really any difference in someone that's doing something entirely from the place of ego and someone that's doing something, entirely selflessly? And that actually kind of raises a thought in my mind because there are kind of these two different approaches to self-realization, whatever you want to call it, to this path, right? One is the path of inclusion, right? Where you kind of almost let go of your individual self, right? And you just include everything, everyone, right? Take care of everything, take care of everyone. And the other path is total exclusion, right? Where you drop absolutely everything, right? And in a sense, they're almost like the same path. I mean, mm, I don't know. I'm stirring the pot, and
Okay, let's bring in again a quote which we brought in probably like, I don't know, 10 times already, but the quote of before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water; after enlightenment, chop wood, carry water, which alludes to, I think, a similar idea that, even after complete self-realization, perhaps merging with everything and coming back, whatever you do doesn't change.
mm,
Yet i can I can only imagine that the chopping wood and carrying water after enlightenment has to have so much more depth. Yet, is it the same experience or not? So, uh, to maybe phrase the question in a bit different way, there's this there's a sleepwalking way of doing things, and then there's an awakened way of doing things, yet you are doing the same thing.
yeah.
And is it actually a different thing you're doing, or is it the same thing that you're doing? If that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you can do the exact same thing externally, and it's really coming from a totally different place internally. And I think, as you were saying that, I think the difference, it really comes down to your relationship with what you're doing. So with chop wood and carry water, right? It's your relationship to that activity. Externally, you can do it from either position, either the position of, feeling aversion or attachment to it, or and I think that's sort of like the more egoic way, if we want to, and again, not trying to say that ego is bad, but really just trying to differentiate, right? Which I think is the difficult thing that we're trying to do here, right? And so I think it's this question of how do I relate to it when it's coming from a place of total ego? It's like, okay, this is my chore. I hate having to do this. Maybe it's not fair. Maybe I want a well so that I don't have to carry water, right? And it's very ego. It's very like kind of self-centric, or I guess you could say. And then the flip side, sort of the more enlightened side of your relationship to that is it's it just is. There really isn't like oh, woe is me, or this is my chore that I have to do. And you're not even right. You're not even attached to either the activity itself or the fruits of the activity, right? So even if um, you just carried water 5 miles and you find out that it's tainted, or there was a hole in your bucket and you lost it all or something, it doesn't affect you as much, right? Like if you're in that more enlightened state, then it's like, oh, okay, that's what happened. I guess I need to remedy this and go do it again or whatever. But if you're in that more ego state, maybe it really makes you angry. Oh, this was, and then maybe you start projecting blame, like, uh, my spouse gave me this bucket and they should have made sure that it didn't have any holes in it or something, right? And it really works you up, right? It's almost like it's the difference. It's like surfing, right?
Hmm.
And the wave is pulling you under constantly when you're in this very egoic state, and when you're not, you're kind of above it. You're just riding the wave, and it doesn't matter what comes. You're just there. You're just floating.
Yeah, so there's much less friction when your internal experience is a experience of not trying to be attached to anything, of trying to surrender, of letting the experience go through you. Yeah, it must be so much less friction. And in that sense, I'm not even sure if you know because the friction that we create by our ego, by creating this stress of I'm not letting go, I'm not accepting reality, I want this moment to be different. With, I don't know, whatever, you need to wash the dishes, which is a boring chore, and you can suffer through it. Or you could take it as kind of a mindfulness exercise where you're just accepting that this is what I'm doing now. Let's see what interesting experience can come out of it. When I give it my full awareness. And in that sense, I guess the paths would never be exactly the same, but you can do like the same activity from two very different experiences. I guess this is what we would call the pathless path, in the sense
Mm.
that you can take any path as a path that leads you to self-realization, right? Because all that we need to do is adjust our internal attitude. So that's an interesting realization, and I think it's captured in Buddhism with the term samadhi, where you don't need to sit in meditation necessarily for 10 years in a cave to achieve it. You can also achieve it walking the pathless path of doing whatever it is that you like to do. And this is something interesting which Michael Singer always pointed to. In the beginning, when I started on this path of self-realization, I thought that I must change my everyday work. For example, I really need to change my life in very concrete ways, very fast, in order to walk on this spiritual path or whatever. But what he was always talking about was, using everyday life and the triggers of everyday life to get further on a path of self-actualization. And there's nothing wrong with doing a regular 9 to 5 job, and it could, give you the same amount of self-realization as any path. And I always found that curious, but I now see it reflected also in some Buddhist concepts. And yeah, I guess this just confirms it. Like, we can walk any path.
Yeah, yeah. I'd say almost the most valuable path is really the one that you're already on, right? Because and of course, silent retreats and all those things are very, very useful, right? Not saying not to do that, but I'm saying maybe you don't, you know, run away from this life and go live in a cave or something like that. That's almost maybe even antithetical in a sense, right? Because the stuff that you need to work with is the stuff that you're trying to escape, right? And so if you escape it, then there's not really a lot to work with. I mean, of course, other things, you're going to take that stuff with you no matter where you go, right? But maybe it's easiest to work with it in the situation that you're already in, rather than potentially escaping it to some degree. Um, so yeah, it's interesting, and kind of makes me want to bring us back to that original topic of like, how does your life change? And one of the answers that we're kind of giving to that right now is that, well, externally your life might not change at all, but the other thing that we're also kind of pointing at is your experience of it can change drastically, right? Your experience of chop wood and carry water might go from it being a chore to being a joy, right? And it doesn't have to, externally, it doesn't have to look any different necessarily. It's all a question of how you're relating to it, kind of like at an internal level.
Yeah, one thing that did change for me though is the level of perceived agency I have in each situation. So, for example, what I noticed in my experience, that I'm in a situation and I'm now able to bring much more intention into any situation. So where perhaps before, and this shows, by the way, best in difficult situations, because difficult situations seem to throw people out of balance quickly. And while you're in the practice of not being thrown out of balance all the time, now you're the person sometimes in the room with the most I don't know, calmness or whatever to a
Mhm.
situation, who doesn't get shaken by it. And then you're able to keep the intention, and you are able to act in a much more precise way than other people are, perhaps. And I think it is something that people appreciate, so, and which also surprises people, because
Mm.
perhaps they themselves have difficulty sticking to their intentions, or even thinking about intentions in each moment. And this is something which gets much richer. So I have the feeling that maybe not every situation, but I noticed often that in situations, I have this agency of like where I catch myself in the moments like, okay, how could I steer this situation now? Where before, the situation would have just like ridden past me, like I wouldn't even have thought about it. I would just go with like whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And that's been my experience as well, is that you do tend to have more agency, especially in those situations that you would have otherwise reacted like in a very habitual way because you were, you know, overly anxious, overly angry, or whatever, right? Um, so, and that is, with so many of the philosophies that we talk about, liberation really is kind of like the end goal, and it does seem to be, accurate, right? It does seem that the things that we do give us more freedom in a sense, and it's a very paradoxical sense because at the same time we're also like we're taking more responsibility, but in that we're also gaining more freedom, which is, I guess, it's paradoxical within our culture because responsibility tends to almost be like a bit of a dirty word. Like it means that you have to do something that you otherwise didn't have to do. It meant that if something goes wrong, now you're to blame. Blame is very closely associated with responsibility. And I think, oftentimes our language
Hmm.
kind of almost works against us, right? Because I think that when you do take responsibility, at least for how you're experiencing things, like you don't necessarily, it's not saying that you're responsible for everything that's going on externally. You can't necessarily control those things, but you can eventually, especially with practice, control the way that you relate to it. You can give yourself more space in that relationship. You can, and what you touched on is other people in that situation are also benefited by that, right? And it's, I'd use the phrase holding space, right? When you're kind of bringing this spaciousness through your own relationship to a situation, you're giving other people more space to do the same. It's makes it so much easier for other people to change. It's You no longer have expectations for how other people are going to show up, and they are no longer bound by your expectations of them, because that is a really important thing. I think I want to tease out a little bit is that one of the things that makes change so difficult is other people's expectations of us, right? They expect us to behave a certain way. They expect us to react to certain things, right? And when we don't do that, it can be irritating for them, right? And then they can push on us to try and get us to react in a certain way, and it can be challenge for us. Like it is difficult to grow when other people are expecting you to be a certain way, and then it kind of makes it harder.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is maybe the exact mechanism by which this heightened awareness spreads
Mm.
in a way.
Yeah,
Because yeah, people are almost sometimes surprised by the fact that you're not attached to something that is happening. I think this is inspiring for people because I mean, in a sense, you're
yeah,
co-regulating people.
yeah,
I don't know. Let's say you're in a plane and there's turbulences, and the person sitting next to you, who's perhaps a stranger, is very uncomfortable with that. If you are able to stay completely calm and relaxed and perhaps talk to the person, this is probably the best thing you can do for the person, as opposed to you together with a stranger, panicking, which would just make the situation worse. So this is already a gift in the situation. You decided to detach yourself personally or on some level from the situation, and that sense are able to stay calm, and you're co-regulating everybody else who's going through the experience with you. And I think this can be um, inspiration for people, and as opposed to preaching about spirituality and awareness and all of these things and trying
yeah,
to push
right.
this on people, which can be have the opposite effect, obviously.
Yep,
And
yep.
I get it, and it should be like that. I
Mhm.
think this is the way that it spreads somehow naturally. That we notice that people react in unexpected ways, and more people pay attention to that. Then they draw people in to the degree that you have these spiritual masters which start gathering people around them naturally somehow, because everybody is just amazed by how they're able to not react as you would predict in pretty much every situation. I think this is also why you have these spiritual sanghas happening with spiritual masters, where you have dozens, sometimes like hundreds of people gathering in front of
Hmm.
spiritual masters and just being like, "Can I please ask you a question? Because I have no way of predicting, your answer," as opposed to anybody else who is quote unquote asleep. They cannot help me that much with my problem, like somebody that comes from a place of pure awareness.
Yeah, yeah, and I'd go back to this idea of like holding space and almost like creating empty space, giving people an opportunity to. It's almost like things will unfold in the best way possible as long as it's not too cramped, as long as I'm not trying to impose my ideology on the situation. It'll just, I mean, in a sense, it's nature, right? I mean, the plants will grow towards the sun as long as there's nothing like occluding them, as long as there's kind of nothing in the way pushing them in a different direction. So and this kind of gets back to like basic goodness, right? Which is kind of a concept in, from what I understand, like Tibetan Buddhism, or at least I've come across it, right? From that same book that I mentioned earlier, Shambhala, where basic goodness is, there's sort of like no opposite to it, and basic goodness is, the sun shines and the plants grow, and that's a good thing, and there's not really like an opposite to it, and it's something that's inherent in everything in existence, certainly ourselves included. And just given the appropriate environment where we're not being pushed around, that basic goodness tends to shine forth, right? When we're not being judged for the things that we judge ourselves for, right? So like with your example of the turbulence on the airplane and the person next to you freaking out, there's a couple different ways that you can respond to that. You can kind of join in with them, and that's not going to be helpful because then you're both freaking out, probably like building each other up. You can get upset with them because you're like, it bothers you, and so you can push against them, and that's going to make it's going to make both of you have an unpleasant situation, have an unpleasant experience. But it's also going to be more difficult for them because they are even more averse towards their reaction. They're pushing against their reaction even more. Um, they don't want it. Like, I don't want to have this anxiety. It's bothering this person next to me, and that's making me even more anxious. Now I want it even less, right? Or if you're just kind of holding space, if you're just calm, if everything's just okay, and it's like, hey, it's okay if you're freaking out. I'm here. I'm not gonna get upset. I'm just gonna be here with you, and you're really well composed and calm. I think that's really the best thing that you can do. You don't have to tell them how to fix it, right? And that's a big hurdle, I think, in our society. Definitely one that guys have a tendency to do it, but everyone has a tendency to try to fix, right? If someone's coming to you with, they're venting and they're experiencing turbulence, there's a tendency to be like, oh, well, you should ignore that, or you should go do this, or you should do this, or there's a tendency to try to fix it rather than just allow them to be the way that they are. And as much as that does come generally from an altruistic place of like, hey, I do want to help this person, I think sometimes it's not helpful in the sense that it causes them to experience more aversion. It introduces more aversion into their relationship with that thing, when really the like they don't want to feel the way that they feel. And if you told them that it was okay for them to feel that way, that might be more valuable, more helpful in actually trying to fix what's going on in the facade externally.
Hmm. I think what happens underneath in each situation is that we are choosing where we put our attention to, and we could put our attention towards our past and our past patterns that are trying to predict what happens in each situation. So the anxiety that we had
Mm-hmm.
a negative experience and we're predicting that this is going to happen now again, we could put a focus there, and this would increase anxiety until we start to panic. And what we're actually doing when we're staying in the moment is we're actually choosing to reject whatever stories or mind built up over the past, and we're deciding to meet the moment with a on a weird level, with some kind of objectivity, in the sense that, you
Mhm.
know,
Okay.
I actually don't know what the next moment holds, but so far, you know, everything has been fine. I've woken up every day, you know, on a base level at least. You know, this experience has been fine, and I have no reason to think that the next moment is not going to be fine. So I might as well rest in the unknowingness of whatever is going to happen next. Yet I also don't need to have this tendency of anticipating anything negatively or damaging for me to happen. And I think it's basically, to if we phrase it in a different way, it's non-judgment. I am not judging whatever is happening
Mm-hmm.
next. And this is freeing, for the moment and for the experience. And I think what is it why it is also attractive for people is because you're, perhaps then also able to meet people without judgment. And I think this is
Mm-hmm.
a
Yeah.
very, unfortunately, uncommon experience for people, to be seen without judgment, uh, from other people. Because, I mean, people judge themselves. We
Yeah.
judge ourselves all the time. So this is already kind of, tiring. And then people judge us all the time, and we can also feel it and sense it. And then suddenly you meet somebody who's like empty, and who's just talking to you, and does not anticipate whatever's going to happen next, and just sees you as whatever is visible in that moment. I think this, creates so much space in people's experience, that, it can be almost, magnetic. You're drawn to people who are able to approach you with that attitude, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's almost like nature abhors a vacuum, and if you make yourself a vacuum in a sense, if you bring a lot of emptiness, then people will just naturally come towards you to sort of fill that space. But if you're really full, if you're really heady, if you're really projecting a lot out, and you're really trying to impose a lot, that's going to repel people, I think, in general.
Yeah.
Um,
I want to pick up, one tangent that you kind of opened, or one topic that you started. You started talking about, responsibility, and,
mm,
I find that interesting, because responsibility is this very unsexy thing. I think, at least for most people, it's not exactly desirable, right? To have responsibilities, like, ugh, go away with that stuff. I'm responsible for so many things now. This also, I don't want to take even more responsibility than I'm already taking for whatever your responsibilities are, your family, whatever.
yeah.
Yet, this is something that, uh, inherently comes, on the path of self realization. I have the feeling, with all of these, opened possibilities that we described, and all of this, added agency that you have, it's also, you might want to use that for something good. And, in that sense, to maybe ask the question, which we talked about in the beginning, or even before we started recording, is all of this stuff maybe a burden to
Yeah.
or or yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good question, because is it a burden? Whew. Yeah. I guess I would say, I mean, you almost have to start to define burden. Do you have more capacity to change things? I would say yes. And you could certainly see that as a burden. You could see that as being heavy, especially depending upon how what connotation of responsibility you see it as. Like if responsibility is a burden, then yeah, this path will potentially burden you. But at the same time, it'll also alleviate you of those burdens, because the ideas, your attachments and your identifications that make responsibility burdensome will start to go away, right? I mean, that's kind of part of the path, is that you start to let go of some of those beliefs. So, for example, like if you're using the example of a family and saying if you're responsible for taking care of your family, is that more of a burden? It depends on what you believe, right? Like if you believe
Mm.
that, oh, now because of my family, I have to go do this job that I don't want to do, right? If you hold that belief, if you hold that story, it's not the responsibility of the family that's actually weighing on you. It's the story that you're imposing on yourself that's weighing on you, right? So responsibility is a burden depending upon what you believe. And on this path, in order to travel this path, you're going to start having to let go of many of the things that you believe. And so you'll start to see that responsibility is not a burden. If anything, it's empowering. If you're not responsible for something, then you can't do anything about it, right? That's one of the ways that I like to put it, is if I don't take responsibility for something and something is a way that I don't like, what can I do? I can complain to the people that I think are responsible. But if I take responsibility, right, and I don't necessarily see that responsibility as a burden, because I don't hold any beliefs that say I shouldn't be burdened with this, or I shouldn't have to do this, right? Then it's really just empowering. Now I can do something about it.
Yeah, empowering is a good word. So because I overuse the word agency
Mhm.
in this episode so much, so let's use empowering. So it empowers you to do stuff, and it also gives you access to, well, how to describe. For example, so I personally don't feel that responsibility for me is necessarily a burden. Like even I don't know, in a
Yeah.
normal work context, right? You have people who take over more responsibility, of people who prefer not to because they feel it's burdensome. For me, maybe it's not that burdensome because it gives me the opportunity to. Uh, so I'm responsible for more people, but I'm also able to help more people. So I'm also in a position to make more people happy, which in turn makes me more happy, right? So now I'm empowered to give and receive and create so much more happiness than I would have been without this responsibility. So in that sense, for me, it's a win. And for me, anyways, this whole path is a win, perhaps because of that. But I also don't know if
Mm.
that's a personality thing. You know what I mean? For some people, I have the feeling this could be fucking terrible.
I guess what sort of makes us averse towards taking responsibility is, at least for me, what comes to mind is the fear of blame, right? Like I don't want to be responsible for this, because if something goes wrong, then
Mm.
someone's going to blame me for it. And that I think that's what makes us, averse, or makes us sort of repulsed, you could say, by this idea of responsibility, is that we don't want to get blamed because that doesn't feel very good. But once you kind of work through that a little bit more, like once you work through the discomfort of some of the blame, like get to a point where you don't have to defend yourself from blame. Really, I mean, so much of what this path is showing us is that there's really nothing to defend. I mean, the this quote from the Tao Te Ching came to mind earlier, and I think I can bring it up now. And that's the man of Tao can walk abroad without fear, right? And the reason that
Can you repeat it?
the man of Tao,
Okay, the
so
man
the
of
man
Tao.
who follows the Tao, who follows the way, right? The man of Tao can walk abroad without fear. And specifically, at least in the translation I'm familiar with, it says fear of, like, and this is a little, maybe a little funny, but fear of like rhinoceros, fear of soldiers, fear of war, and fear of tigers. And the reason that he is not fear of does not fear these things is because rhinoceros find no place for their horn, tigers find no place for their claws, and soldiers find no place for their weapons. And that means really that there's the man of Tao is in a sense transparent, right? So when it comes to something like blame, someone can blame you, someone can attack you with blame all day, but if you don't really care, if you're not identified with what they're attacking, then it passes right through you. It doesn't matter. They can, yell at you until they're hoarse, and it won't affect you. because there's nothing there to be affected, right? It's like if someone starts insulting you over something that you don't strongly identify with. Like, I really think you made a bad choice with that color of couch that you have behind you or something, and you have no attachment to it. But if you like, you really had to have that particular color, and you went out of your way and you're really attached to it, and it brings the room together and it's the perfect color. And if I say something bad about that color, it's gonna hit you because there's something to hit. But if you don't care, there's nothing to hit.
Yeah. I think it's also similar with fear in general. One of the cool things on this path is that you get to realize how illusory your fears are, and you're kind of able to dissolve them in a way. And I guess this happens over time. I certainly haven't dissolved all of my fears, but I have a couple of them. And once you have, you realize like, oh my god, they have been so irrational, and they have been slowing me down and creating friction in my life for so long. Because in a way, in life, at least while you were quote unquote asleep, a lot of your decisions are made to avoid certain fears, and fear is kind of steering your life, in that sense being somewhat limited. And now that you understand that fear can be overcome, you can steer towards certain fears, perhaps in a tempo that you feel comfortable with, and maybe not going directly for the dragon or whatever. But you're able to choose new paths which perhaps include some things you're afraid of, but you have the experience of, fear doesn't kill me. I can get through it, and I will live on the other side, and I will also dissolve it in that very act. Which, yeah, it kind of sucks that for fear you cannot dismiss it. You kind of have to go through it. That's a bit uncomfortable, but you also get to liberate yourself from that fear. So to keep using your metaphor, also the fear becomes transparent, and you have so much more possibility, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. In terms of fear, I think it's sort of, we think that there's something solid there, right? Like, this is kind of demonstrating the power of the mind to create solidity out of nothing, right? And that's what we're constantly doing, and we don't realize the power in doing that. And most of what we're doing it for is maybe you could say counterproductive, or it's not always in our best interest. It's, certainly not in our best interest to create a real solid fear of something, right? And like you were saying, for better or for worse, the way through that is to confront it, like, with awareness, right? Because of course you can, like, close your eyes, grit your teeth, and just run into it or something, but that doesn't reveal it for the nothing that it really is, because maybe you're not aware enough to really see it. So I guess, yeah, one of the best ways to deal with fear is to confront it in a very, very conscious way, so that you're able to kind of maintain your awareness throughout. And you will usually reach a point where you see that there really was nothing there in the first place, that it was all just in your head. Easier said than done with with many things. I think you don't necessarily have to seek it out too much. Life does have a tendency, as Michael Singer says, life has a tendency to bring these things up for you, right? So you don't necessarily, like, have to get too masochistic about exposing yourself to your fears. Just be gradual about it. I would say, you can expose yourself a little bit, but don't force it. And of course, it's not helpful to force it with the idea or with the intention that I don't want to feel this anymore, because really you're just tricking yourself at that point. You're reinforcing the fear because you're saying I don't want it, right? You almost have to, like, embrace it, right? I mean, I think that's a bit cliche, but I think it's also kind of true.
So that brings me to the kind of the next point to that could answer the question, like, how does your life change once you start going on the path of self-realization? And this is maybe the last point
Yeah.
I'm going to add here, is it will also, like, you will be accustomed to the fact that your path will now also include negative experiences,
Mm.
negative, I mean, in any sense. and being okay with that. Because for a very long time before I start turning down this path, I thought that meditation is about acquiring the skill of always feeling good.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
This is kind of I thought it's about summoning that the meditation is going to be, this is going to be my happy place, and this is going to be my tool which I use when life is difficult. I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to feel bliss, and I'm going to be able to walk through life uh, always blissfully.
Yeah.
And maybe on some level that is the truth, but I think what people should know is that on this path you're going to go through your fears, like we
Right.
mentioned, and you're going to go through negative experiences. But what will be different is that you will not decline them. And
Yeah.
by not declining them, you will not create this huge friction, which used to create uh, huge problems out of very small problems, in a sense, right?
Yeah.
Because we used to decline any negative experience in our life, and you know whatever it is, you're catching a cold, so, oh, now I'm catching a cold.
Yeah.
And then instead of just having a cold, now you're also miserable
Right.
for 2 weeks about it, and you're creating this huge experience of suffering. You're making perhaps whoever lives with you miserable along the way, and complaining and creating so much more suffering out of a small thing. I think this is what will change. Yes, there will be perhaps even very difficult things on your path. I mean, facing even death of people close to you, as difficult as it gets, I guess. But not rejecting it will be what changed about it. And also a knowingness that there's always something valuable, even in quote unquote negative experiences.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Hmm. See, where do I want to jump in there? So many good places. Yeah, I would say that with everyone who gets into meditation, I mean, certainly for myself, the reason that I got in was exactly what you were talking about. I wanted to alleviate the suffering, and I thought that on the other side, it was just going to be like easier, it's just going to be blissful. I was going to be able to, something bad's going down, I'm go meditate, it'll make it all better. And to some degree, that might be true-ish, but I think we kind of paint too rosy of a picture of what we think it's supposed to look like. And you will encounter a lot of challenges. I would say to kind of motivate it, and this is something that we kind of touched on a little bit in the beginning, especially when you first start meditating, it's going to seem like things are getting worse. I think that is a very common experience, and I think sort of the reason that is your mind is busier than you realize. The question is it possible that you're having thoughts that you're not even aware of? And I would say that absolutely, absolutely. And when you start examining that, and these thoughts start coming to your awareness, it's going to seem like your mind is busier. It's going to seem like I'm not good at meditation. I try to meditate and my mind gets worse. It's not so much true. What's really going on is you're just more aware of what was already there, right? And in terms of, like, say, net suffering, so like the total amount of suffering that you're going to go through in your life, I would say that this path is a very wise investment, in the sense that if you don't confront these things, if you don't confront your fears, they're going to plague you over and over and over again. Even if you don't necessarily like go through the discomfort of directly confronting it, it's going to cause you to suffer. It's going to rob you of agency. It's going to rob you of freedom, right? And it's going to cost you so much more than if you just kind of like bite the bullet and work with it and examine it. And it is uncomfortable, right? I think that's really important thing to concede, is that this path is uncomfortable. But again, I also say that it was going to be uncomfortable either way. If you didn't go down this path, it was going to be worse. You maybe weren't going to be aware of it as much. But it's also just really, really valuable. Honestly, everything that I personally wanted in my life that the outside world didn't ever supply for me, I find I already had it sort of within myself when I start to unlock myself, sort of start to free myself from so much that I unintentionally adopted and imposed on myself. And it's a little, it can be a little bit scary because you are kind of replacing solidity with emptiness. You are replacing something that is known with something that is unknown, and that can be kind of scary. We do have almost an innate aversion towards uncertainty and not knowing. Um, and I suppose that's to some degree a survival mechanism, right? It's easier to survive in the known, I suppose, but also, taken to the extreme, um, it just makes your life nothing. It makes it smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. And I think that's one of the things that we suffer the most as we age, is as we adopt more and more um, likes and dislikes, and I need things to be this way, and expectations. Then your world, and the world that is capable of making you happy, becomes less and less and less and less. Um, when in reality, there's so much more that can that you can really enjoy. And the weird thing about it is, even some of the things that you previously thought were negative start to take on this quality of sweetness, this quality of sort of like having an extra depth. For example, like sadness, really experiencing that can be a pretty beautiful thing. It's not, it's not necessarily something that you go and seek, but when you do experience it, it's like it's like watching a really good sad movie or something. It's enjoyable. There's a certain texture to it. There's a certain quality to it. There's a certain aliveness to it that it otherwise, when you weren't aware, it did not have that. It was just something that you suffered.
Yeah, very, very nicely said. And even only for that, what you just described, for me, it's already worth to walk down this path. And now thinking about it again, yeah, I don't think I would go back. It's pretty enjoyable and rewarding to be on this path.
Yeah, 100%.